think for me, I just have a hard time finding hope in a lot of this work, right? This is not oftentimes uplifting work that I'm doing on a daily basis. And I think that if I have limited hours in a day, right? And if I spend all my time trying to search for hope, look for stories that are hopeful, then I'm going to be seeking those out to make myself feel better. And for me, I've just reached a point where I don't feel like I really need to do that, right? I have other things that are motivating me to work every single day and to chip away at, creating change within our emergency management system. And so I think that's an important thing for people to hear. I think that there are some people who are really motivated by that hope, and thinking about hope for the future is what drives them into action every day. I think that there are also people who don't really need that to get work done. And I think when you hear kind of these broader conversations happening in climate spaces, a lot of times we get a little bit sidetracked by those stories about hope and kind of searching for those stories about hope. And again, because this is such an urgent issue, if you're not somebody who needs that, I think it's okay to say, you know what, I'm not going to spend my time dealing with that. I'm going to focus on these concrete actions that I feel like I have some influence or some control over, and try to push those forward.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Environmental Coffee House. I'm your host, Sandy Shellis, and tonight my guest is Dr. Samantha Montano, and she is a very important guest at this time in our history of climate breakdown and all the disasters. She wrote a book called Disasterology, which I listened to on audiobook the last few days, which was really, really good. I've watched other interviews with her. I am so impressed. Welcome, Dr. Montano, and hello, everybody out there, and thank you to all our moderators. Hello, Samantha.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, it's been quite a day. Samantha and I were on X Twit or Twit X or whatever you want to call it, countering all of the bullshit that is flying around, all of the conspiracy, all of the lies, and we were sort of tag teaming today. And I was all over my Facebook because I was very angry today. So we're going to get into that. But first, let's hear all about you.
Sure. So I am a disaster researcher. I have my PhD in emergency management and have been involved in disaster work since Hurricane Katrina and the levee failure in New Orleans. So for 19 years about at this point. So I do all kinds of disaster research. I teach. I'm an assistant professor at Massachusetts Maritime Academy in the emergency management undergrad program there. And I also do a lot of public engagement policy work to help educate folks about the emergency management system and policy work to try and make changes to that system.
Just terrific. And you went to the same school that our Nicholas Humphrey is just about finished with his PhD.
I did. Yes. We are both NDSU products.
Yes. And so I understand, though, they, at this time of need, they're discontinuing the program.
Yeah, really devastating loss for the discipline and professions of emergency management. But the North Dakota State Legislature told NDSU they needed to make budget cuts, and inexplicably, the emergency management PhD program was cut. So yeah, I think Nick will be the last one to
Yeah,
graduate with it.
that's what he said. And that's a big loss. So who's going to pick up the slack?
Great question. We don't know really. There's only a couple other emergency management PhD programs in the
Oh,
country, and they kind of each have their own struggles in their own ways. So there's a kind of a real question about what that future looks like right now.
and that's tough because this is such a critical field, so needed, and especially for PhDs who have advanced studies to understand all of these issues. There are so many agencies, there's so many issues. And I think one of the things I'd like you to talk about is the agencies, the government, NGOs, and the interplay between that, and then how a PhD that does research on this mixes with the agencies and helps the agencies.
Yeah, so emergency management is this really broad area that involves actually everyone. Like we're all, as individuals, a part of the emergency management system, whether we know it or not. And so, one of the kind of real values of having people with advanced degrees in emergency management is that you have people who have had the opportunity to really study how this system works overall and how these different parts of the emergency management system, the different government agencies, the nonprofit sector, businesses,
Yeah.
mutual aid groups, individuals, how they all interact with one another across before, during, and after disasters. And so that kind of having that overarching perspective of how the system operates is really critical. And then also doing the empirical research
Yeah.
to help us better understand if we are approaching emergency management in effective ways or not. And that research involves everything from a little bit nerdy theory building and model building all the way to how do we operationalize this research and how do we connect this into policy changes and how do we get this into practice so that we're actually able to influence what's happening on the ground in communities when they experience disasters.
It's an incredible field. So, in your background, it was Katrina.
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in Maine, so very far away from New Orleans and from Katrina, but I had an opportunity to go down and volunteer. And so I went just for the week and really had no idea what to expect. No, I'd never seen destruction on that scale before. And when I got to New Orleans, it was just mile after mile of complete devastation. And it was just so clear to me, months after the storm, that there was still so much help that was needed and that this was going to be an all hands on deck situation. And so I made the kind of dramatic decision at the time to move to New Orleans and help with the recovery in the long term. So I lived there for 4 years, worked with a whole bunch of different recovery organizations. While I was there, the BP oil disaster happened. I was involved in that response and recovery. And I kind of disaster hopped around the country. I was like,
Disaster hopped.
yeah.
That's a new one. That's a new one.
Yeah. There's a lot of volunteer opportunities and a lot of places that need those extra helping hands. And so I did that for a while. And as I was doing that, we just saw problem after problem in how we were approaching response and recovery and how we were thinking about preventing these events in the future. And so I eventually ended up learning that you can study emergency management, which I did not know was a thing. And I kind of very luckily stumbled into that. And so I went to graduate school with the intent of trying to see how we could use research to make our response and recovery efforts more effective and equitable across the country.
And has that been fruitful?
I mean, yeah, I think so. Look, volunteer work and working with nonprofits that do disaster work is incredibly important. But it
Yes.
is really slow going. You're literally like rebuilding house by house, right?
Yeah.
This is a very slow, laborious process. And what I have found is that, um, while that work is important, we also really need people who are pushing for reform in our overall system, right? And that's going to make the work that people are doing on the ground easier ultimately. And so I think making the decision to go to grad school, reading all of the research that we have on disasters and emergency management, which is plentiful,
Yeah.
that I, have an educational foundation now to be able to think about policy in kind of a more useful way, than I kind of thought about it when I only had that in the field experience.
So you're teaching at the Maritime
Hmm.
Academy, but are you also involved in any governmental actions or FEMA or any kind of are you a consultant? Do you do work with the government that way?
No, not really. I do not work for FEMA at all.
Okay.
The kind of closest thing here is that I give a lot of talks at, emergency management conferences. Each state emergency management association has conferences every year.
Yeah.
Um, that's kind of how I interface with practice.
Hmm.
Um, in helping, bridge that gap between research and practice.
Oh, I would love to hear you speak at one of those. I'm fascinated by the field, even more so now. And Nicholas got me interested, but now I think more than ever, I'm so proud of him, first of all, and I'm proud of you. And I think it's anybody out there listening, if you're young and you're looking for something that you need to feel is important to put your feet on the ground, this is it. This really is, I think. And just the interplay with all these professionals that cross your path has to be incredible.
Yeah, it is. Emergency management is such an interesting field too, because, although there are a lot of people in it, it still feels like a very small field. And you run into the same people over and over again. And a lot of those people have, deeply fascinating backstories. And, you'll be talking to
Yeah.
somebody and realize, oh, they were in charge of this like really famous disaster response years
Oh,
ago. And
wow.
there's a lot of heaviness that comes with that and with being in this field, but it's also, gives you a really kind of different perspective of, kind of what is unfolding around us in these events and in the context of climate change.
Well, one of our my friends and one of our followers, my personal friend Jackie, who's been a guest, is a soil scientist, but she is a volunteer with the Red Cross, waiting
Mm.
for her orders right now. She does assessments. She does damage disaster assessments, and it's pretty hairy. And she has a lot to deal with. We already had a question, and I think I'm going to ask this question right now because I think this is a good place. How do you keep from getting overwhelmed seeing disaster after disaster? And thank you for what you do. We need you more than ever.
Yeah, that's a great, great question. It's really tough, frankly. It requires a lot of compartmentalization. And I've also found over the years, it's really important to know kind of when you hit your breaking point in a disaster and knowing when you need to step back and take time off and walk away. Which is, tough for anybody to do. This is something that is like a huge issue in our field. It's only been in the past few years that we've really started talking about mental health in our field.
Yes.
We're working in our field. It's something that, I have like mostly 18-year-old students who are starting out in the field. So I like work with them from the start to start thinking about protecting their mental health and getting to, um, better, know themselves better, right? And to know
Sure.
where those triggers are and where you need to take a step back.
So it's going to be a whole other area of study is mental health professionals for disasterologists, for disaster professionals, because it is getting more and more, and as we see the climate breakdown occurring, and you work in the United States, but this is going to be a worldwide need. We can't
Mm-hmm.
just let people float on their own, especially
Right.
in the field that you're in. So thank you for answering that question. So with your students, what do you find is the most well, what's appealing to them? What made them choose to go into such a profession, which is actually so giving of yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends. It's different things for different students. Some students have had an experience with a disaster, and that has motivated them to kind of seek out this field. Others are really drawn to like international humanitarian work. We have some who, want to become firefighters and work specifically on that hazard. We have some that are really concerned about climate change and are wanting to find ways to be active in that space. Some of them just kind of stumble into it and then find out that they really like it or they don't like it. So all different things, really.
That's great. I think it's a selfless. In fact, Jackie just came into the chat, and our Red Cross. Typically, there are many mental health pros in disaster. They're never far away when deployed. Thanks, Jackie. We are thinking about you because we know you're going to be out there. She's going to have her boots on the ground, literal boots. I've seen her boots, and I know what she does. So thank you, Jackie. I'm glad you're here. So actually, then tell me about your interaction with people that are on the ground or in these different NGOs, besides maybe just speaking. What kind of interactions do you have aside from conferences and things like that?
Yeah, all kinds of ways, really. So, I sometimes I am out there volunteering with various organizations. So, for example, this past summer, I spent a month in Northern California with my students, volunteering
Oh,
with Rubicon on wildfire recovery from the Caldor fire. There's those kind of like on the ground experiences that I still have.
yeah.
Sometimes I deploy for quick response research, which is where we're collecting perishable data during the actual response. We try to not have to do that, but sometimes it's necessary. And then also just kind of through I give a lot of public talks. Like I wrote the book, which is meant for the general public, so I have a lot of like
Mm-hmm.
random people who have stumbled onto it. And then like through various social media channels, I would say people tend to want to talk about disasters. That's an interesting topic. So kind of everywhere I go, I'm hearing from people their disaster stories.
Wow. Do you have a
Yeah.
story you want to share? Something that comes right to the top of your head?
Oh gosh. I
All right,
really
I put you on. All right, you could tell us maybe
uh,
something of yours.
no, I'll tell you a funny story about this actually, if you want.
Sure.
Um, lighten the mood here. So I was several years ago. I went to go get a massage. I said, some self care. Let's go get a massage. And while I was there, the masseuse asked me what I did. And I was like, oh. And I told her, and she then spent the next 45 minutes asking me questions about the Haiti earthquake, which is not exactly a relaxing topic.
No,
So,
I would say
yeah, no, all kinds of
she needed you. She
like
needed you.
she had a lot of thoughts on it. Like, well, that
Wow.
was 10 years ago, but all right.
Do you ever well, do you go? Would you go to another country, or is it basically American disaster since we certainly have enough?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tend to focus just on the United States. Depending on what, so every once in a while I'll do some kind of international work or give a talk internationally. But I'm primarily focused on the US. And as you pointed out, we have so many disasters that there's more than I can handle here, let alone elsewhere. But also country to country emergency management looks very different. So in terms of my expertise, it's really focused on the US system.
Right. Because we have so many different NGOs. Give me an example, or give us an example of one of the NGOs you might work closely with.
So there's all different kinds. So I mentioned Team Rubicon earlier. For folks that don't know, they're primarily a veteran-run volunteer organization that goes in right after disasters. They're, in North Carolina right now helping with response. They do a lot of chainsawing to get trees out of a lot of like hard physical labor.
Yeah.
I also work in New Orleans, for example. I take students down there every year as well. For the past couple of years, we've volunteered with an organization called Louisiana Just Recovery Network, which is kind of like a mutual aid network group on the Gulf Coast. So all different types of organizations.
Oh, this is so interesting. My gosh. So if you're faced with, you're teaching, you have a schedule, but if there is something, do you ever deploy with anybody, or does your institution send you, or will you go with a group of students to have boots on the ground?
Yeah. I don't usually go in the middle of a semester. That would be I have
Kinda
before.
hard.
Wait, yeah, that's tough. But actually, speaking of Hurricane Helene, I do think we're about to have a couple students who are going to go out and deploy within a couple weeks, probably. So yeah, that's definitely something that emergency management students are doing.
That's great. It's great. It's needed. So speaking of Helene, since you started, and over the years, have you seen a change in the public perception of response to these disasters?
Yeah, it's so interesting because, as I said, my start was with Katrina, where you have this massive government failure to respond, and FEMA in particular. And so when I got started in disaster work in New Orleans, FEMA was like a dirty word, right? Like we did not like FEMA. They were bad. And it took a while actually of me being in grad school to kind of come around a little bit, right? To still acknowledge the New Orleans response was a failure, but to say there actually is a real value to this agency, and they're not doing everything right at all, but I think it's fixable, and here's what we need to do, right? So that has been a kind of a journey that I've been on the past several years. But I think that's also kind of a journey that a lot of the public has been on too, right? Katrina is still really the kind of disaster of record. You're seeing it get brought up in comparison to Helene, and that's common, right? When we have these major disasters. So that memory of the federal failures and FEMA's failures and Katrina has really kind of clung to that agency, and FEMA has worked really hard in the past 19 years to try and remedy that reputation, try to remedy the problems that happened in New Orleans. And I would say they are often successful in doing that. Of course, not always. You have the Hurricane Maria response, again, another failure there from the federal government.
What was the failure specifically?
Oh, with Maria?
Yeah. Give us a taste.
Sure.
Give us a taste.
A lot of similarities with Katrina, really, in some ways. There, you see this just breakdown in the federal response, right? You have a situation where the impacts are so extreme that local and territorial government is completely overwhelmed, right? And when we have that happen, we actually are like jumping categories of events. We're not dealing with a disaster anymore. We're dealing with what we call a catastrophe. And with Maria, you see that breakdown in leadership. You remember the president was fighting with the mayor of San Juan. You have, the federal government, particularly the White House, lying about, death tolls and the accurate, what's happening with the response.
Yeah.
And so there are all kinds of different factors are playing into that failure, but it was to such an extreme that the appropriate comparison, everybody loves to compare a disaster to Katrina. The actual comparison is Maria, in terms of the actual response failures.
Wow. So what is FEMA doing right?
Well, it depends on the day. So since Katrina, I would say FEMA has really tried to turn things around internally, have made a lot of changes. They are a bigger agency than they were then. They are like to think of themselves as being kind of a more well-trained and better established agency than they were in 2005. And they've also tried to really repair their relationship with the public. Again, that has not always been successful, but I think that they're much more conscious of.
Because there's been a lot of criticisms today and yesterday. And of course, social media was not as prevalent in 2005 with Katrina as now. And both of us were extremely emotionally attached to the nonsense today. You want to go down that rabbit hole?
Sure, let's do it.
All right, let's do it. I will start with the fact that we actually have representatives in our Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are blaming this on weather modification and that they are doing it, which is a racist dog whistle. We all know who they are. If you had something to say to a person like her, what would you say if you were speaking to Congress? And you speaking to her.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's tough. I think that, the approach here tends to be trying to find some common ground, right? So trying to, trying to find the elements of this event that have some impact for her personally, right? Does she know people who are impacted, right? That tends to be a way into these conversations. But otherwise, I do tend to find, I encounter a lot of crazy climate conspiracy theorists all the time online. And at a certain point, kind of just have to ignore them and try to work with the people who are more amenable to listening to reason and, who are more moved by hearing about real life stories of what people are experiencing as kind of a segue into becoming more educated.
So today there was a lot of crap going around. I mean, it incensed me, and I saw that it incensed you, and it's almost like there's a need every disaster for a social media coordinator to head off all the misinformation and disinformation. I mean, there's a PhD in itself. So tell us about what was going through your mind today as you were. It was almost like we were fending the garbage that was being thrown all over. And it's very sad. And I really said almost the disinformation and the lying is almost worse than Helene.
Yeah. Yeah, look, in every disaster, you are going to encounter misinformation and inaccurate information and some amount of conspiracy theories, right? That has kind of always happened, right? But
Okay.
I think what is different with this particular storm is the extent of it and how pervasive it is. And also kind of worrying here about the jump from, what's just spreading on social media and what's actually making it out onto the ground in these affected communities. I saw earlier today that one community sent out an emergency alert with the
Yes.
specific intent of combating misinformation, which is extremely unusual use, but I think an appropriate one in this case. But I mean, that shows you kind of the extent of this. You've seen, a wide range of politicians from both political
Mm-hmm.
parties, all levels, coming out trying to fend off the misinformation, conspiracy theories. You've seen other politicians stoking it. And yeah, I mean, I cannot think of another disaster where I've seen this extent of
It's
misinformation.
awful.
Yeah.
Awful. I saw the people on Greg Gutfield on Newsmax just lying about all of it because they want to take this and they want to press a message that, oh, all the money is going to immigrants and illegal immigrants, and all you're going to get from FEMA is $750. And they have no idea how FEMA works. Maybe you could give us a little overview of really how FEMA works to
Yeah.
start with this. We give tools to our viewers to stop it themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So FEMA is involved in the response, which is when these life-saving measures are taking place, right? You have their urban search and rescue teams that have been deployed. You have FEMA helping coordinate setting up emergency medical tents, distribution of food and water, those kind of basic things. We're really moving out of the response phase here and going into early days of recovery. And the recovery phase is going to last 15, 20 years for most of these communities that are most impacted. And so what we're seeing happening now is that FEMA is offering this $750 just for these immediate needs, right? So you can go out and buy a new pair of clothes if your house has been destroyed, and to buy food and water, to buy a bus ticket to a family member's house, right? That's what that $750 is for. There will be kind of another wave of funding that comes from FEMA for individuals specifically. And that depends on the county you're in. It's like kind of a complex thing, but most people who have been affected are going to be eligible for this funding. And the amount of funding you can get is depends on your situation. It's up to about, I think it's like $42,000 is the most you can get, around there. Most people get less than that, right? The average amount that people get is really only a couple $1,000s, which is not enough money, right, to rebuild your life. Certainly, that is the critique of FEMA, is how we need to be giving people more money, and Congress needs to allow FEMA to give more money. But that, I think some people have started applying for that additional funding, but we are early days of that, right? We have a long way to go here. So there will be more funding for most people that they can apply to through FEMA. And that's before we get to things like small business administration loans and insurance for some people, and, other potential resources.
So I have a question. I know it seems like a silly one, but who's the person that decided on the $750 amount?
Oh, good
Or
question.
how did that come about? Because that's all I hear is that, I heard one of those right-wing assholes talking about, well, they're just going to get $750 in paltry amount, and how are they going to get through it? And that's just the beginning. And one more question to add to one more thing. People are complaining because they're saying, well, how are we going to get things when we have no phone, no power, and no access? How do we get that?
Yeah. Okay. So the $750, I'd have to go back and like look through some FEMA policy here. I think it's a internal. I think the 750 comes internally from FEMA. The cap, though, of the most being $42,000, that is in the Stafford Act. That comes from Congress.
Okay.
So usually there's kind of, Congress writes the broad law and then FEMA interprets it. So kind of the details of those laws are coming out through FEMA policy. So we need so, and just in terms of the amount here, because I think this is often gets confused here, we need Congress to be the ones to raise that cap, but there are mechanisms within FEMA in terms of policy reform internally to kind of change how that money is being spent. They actually just 6 months, maybe a year ago or so, implemented some changes to individual and household recovery, which we're still kind of waiting to see how that actually plays out in practice. But FEMA does have some control over some elements of this, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
In terms of how do people get things? Great question. Definitely depends on your situation, right? We are seeing that some people are really isolated at this point. Roads have been washed out. They don't have a way of, getting to and from their homes, even if their homes are, physically intact. We're seeing that helicopters are flying in, delivering supplies to folks who want to stay put. Other people are being evacuated and will go stay with friends or family at a hotel, something. So you have folks that are kind of in that situation. You also have folks who have completely lost their homes and again are probably going to go stay somewhere else for a while, right? This is recovery is what takes a really long time.
So we're not going to see FEMA trailers?
Oh, well, we'll see. Maybe.
I mean, people have to have a place to live.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, again, so much of this kind of just depends person to person, community to community. FEMA does have a trailer option. They try to avoid that.
Okay.
I do think, this is a rural enough area where that may be necessary. But there's also safety concerns here with using the trailers. This is, the ground that everybody is on here has been through a trauma. Things are still moving and whatnot. So you've got to be really careful about how you're housing folks. But, a shortage of housing is going to be a massive problem in the short term and long term.
And people may not be able to return to where they live or love and have, in all the states, not just Western North Carolina, but even Florida. But Florida is a little different. Florida, I think they rebuild. They continue to do that. Tell us about what you think about Florida and their disasterology in Florida.
Yeah, Florida certainly as a state has some of the most experience with disasters. And that I think something that's kind of interesting to think about here is what we call disaster subcultures, right? So different places form these kind of different cultures around disasters. This is why when you see that a hurricane is coming towards Louisiana, people are making jokes about having hurricane parties and drinking a lot, right? That's part is sometimes tough to watch. But that also is part of the culture there, right? That's part of coping. That's part of community and like keeping people together in dangerous times. Florida, we tend to see people running around in the storms a bit more than we see in other states. Again, kind of a cultural difference here that poses unique challenges. So, the disaster subculture in Florida is very different than, what that looks like in North Carolina, particularly this part of North Carolina that hasn't had a long history of disasters. And that affects everything from not just cultural things, but also just the amount of knowledge you have about FEMA. If you live in Florida, there's a good chance you've dealt with FEMA before, right?
Right.
But for in many of these communities, they probably never had to interact with FEMA before. So you're going to see some differences there. The issue of evacuation, like why weren't people evacuated ahead of time, has been a question that's been raised. One of the reasons why is because that's not part of the culture there, right? People don't have an evacuation plan. That wasn't something they thought that they really needed, right? Whereas if you're in Florida, you probably do have an evacuation plan, right? And you've probably done it before. So you have that experience. So just in terms of like residents in these states, you see some like pretty significant differences there. In terms of like the actual like formal emergency management system, like EM agencies in these states, Florida has traditionally had a very advanced emergency management system, really post Andrew in the 90s. That system has faced a lot of criticism in more recent years. It's not quite the golden child that it used to be. But again, a system that has more, like by the numbers, has more experience with disasters. North Carolina does have experience, particularly on the eastern part of the state. So at like the state level, you see that experience. But and I will say North Carolina's emergency management system, both at the state and local level, seems to be handling the situation shockingly well.
That's good to hear.
Circumstances. Yeah.
It's good to hear.
We'll see.
Yeah, I know it's early, even though it's not early to the people.
Yeah.
They're suffering. I watched one YouTuber today that has a farming channel, like a homesteading channel. And really, they filmed so much. I cried the whole video. I cried. I live in a farming community. And, who knows if it traveled like that and the strength of the storms because of the sea surface temperature, they're getting bigger and traveling farther, it could happen here. And I just think people don't realize it. It happened when I think it was Irene with Albany, New York, and the flooding there. And it could happen here. And people are going to have to realize nowhere is safe. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, one thing that, there have been several articles written about is this issue of climate havens, which is a term that was kind of popularized in the past couple of years by some of these cities, mostly in the north, who have who think they are more immune from climate impacts than other parts of the country. And yeah, look, Albany is not New Orleans, but that does not mean that they are immune from climate impacts. And Asheville was one of the cities that was on this list, right? And we've heard a couple interviews with folks who have now been through this disaster who have said, I specifically moved to Asheville because I thought we were safe from climate change. I view that really as a failure of climate disaster researchers, emergency managers, for not communicating risk well enough to the public, right? We definitely do not want people to be thinking that there are these places that are immune from climate change or immune from risk. That's not true, right? Every place in the whole world has some kind of risk. And yet, some places, it's more likely for that risk to manifest into a disaster than others. But that does not mean that it isn't possible. And so Asheville, unfortunately, is a lesson in that. Before Asheville, though, we had this in Vermont the past several years, where, again, another place that was thought of as a climate haven, and has now experienced several significant flood events.
Oh yeah, but there we have a channel. I've interviewed Dr. Emily Shorning. She has a channel called American Resiliency, and she does very scientific analysis of each state for climate resilience. And I think she's rethinking some of her declarations of North Carolina, but she's really good, and I'd love to hook you up with her. She's got a team. She's a nonprofit now. And she's doing wonderful work. So I will probably give you her link.
Yeah, that would be great. I think that, one thing that we say in emergency management, often in the context of hurricane season, but I think it applies more broadly, is all it takes is one, right? You
Yeah,
just one disaster. You need one day where everything lines up and goes wrong. So I think it is absolutely smart for people, if you have the ability and the resources, to try and live in places where your risk is lower. I think that, like, I would not go buy a house right on the beach right now, but
no.
um, you know, I think we also have to recognize what that risk is, and then take action wherever we are living to try and minimize that risk as best we can.
Exactly. I mean, I thought for the longest time, here I am moving to a great place. I came here 10 years ago and boom, we had a tornado come through. And now
Mhm.
tornadoes are becoming more prevalent in this area. That just about 20 miles away, they flattened the farm this year, a tornado. And it went through my property in 2017 and decimated so many trees, I can't tell you. It was traumatic. It was horrible to have that happen here on my place, which I thought was safe. And now all we do is I kind of live in a microburst area, so all summer it was torrential rains. Torrential rains. It was just awful. I got a new roof and I had to get skylights. And the roofers literally call them leak lights, and the one that was leaking was in my bathroom, right over my bathtub. But I mean, it seems like nothing compared to what people are going through. But it's still scary. And here I thought, oh, I was living in a good place, but there is no good place. I mean, is that too alarmist?
No, I mean, I guess if there's no good place, then maybe there's no bad place. Who knows?
I mean, there are better
You know,
places. Yeah.
yeah, there are better places. But I mean, people are, I tend to think of, having people move to entirely new places is kind of a last resort option here, right? I think that there's a
Mhm.
lot that we can do before we're in the position of having to have people move across the country or, wherever else.
Right. Because they want to stay in their homes. They want to stay where they live,
Right.
but it
Yeah.
has to be done differently.
Mhm.
Totally differently. I don't know how Florida is doing things differently because people keep rebuilding on the coast, but the insurance companies, do you know anything about the insurance industry in being that you're in disasterology? I mean, do they even confer with you guys?
Um, sometimes, yeah, yeah. I mean, and there's definitely overlap between the insurance industry and disaster risk management. Yeah, the insurance question is obviously something that is front of mind for a lot of Americans right now, whether you're dealing with fires out west or hurricanes on the East Coast and in the Gulf. It's a really complex issue. This is going to be one of the huge challenges with Helene, is that so few people in the areas affected actually had flood insurance.
Right.
Um,
Mm.
and that is a source of that is like the major source of recovery funding for individuals. So that's why when we're talking about how long is this recovery, part of what's factoring into this being a 20-year recovery is that people are not going to be able to come up with these resources on their own through insurance. And we're starting to see a collapse of the insurance industry,
Yes.
frankly, right? Where you have agencies long ago stopped covering floods. That became an uninsurable risk for the private sector. That's why we have federally backed national flood insurance program now. But I suspect we're starting to see that with wildfire happen, right? Where these private insurance companies are pulling out.
Yep.
You have places like Louisiana where homeowners insurance is just skyrocketing, and you have some insurance companies going under after we have these major disasters. So it's a really complex problem, and
Mhm.
one that has huge, huge, huge financial consequences for individuals. And is a potential factor in determining whether or not people are going to continue to live in certain places, right? So it's one, again, this is another issue that is, I kind of think, above the local and state pay grade, and is an issue that Congress needs to take on more seriously.
Do you think this particular Congress, will take this seriously?
Well, no, because they won't even refill the disaster relief fund in the middle
Right.
of hurricane season.
Yeah, didn't they walk out and leave it on the floor and not do anything?
Yeah. So yeah, this is another kind of piece of misinformation that folks may have seen floating around about FEMA running out of money. So FEMA currently has money in what's called the Disaster Relief Fund to pay for the response efforts for Helene. Where there is a major concern here is if we have another disaster, which is Florida is not looking good for next week.
No, next week. My mother lives in Sarasota. I worry about her all the time. She's 90 years old and she's, oh, don't worry, I'm fine.
Yeah. And then also the other major impact here is on recovery. So FEMA had to, over the summer, go into what they call immediate needs funding, which meant they were only spending money really on like response related projects, and they had to pause recovery projects across the country. So, especially with Helene, now we have this other huge recovery to go into. We don't have enough money to go into that in terms of funding like our big infrastructure projects, right? So Congress is going to need to come back and refill the disaster relief fund, especially depending on what happens in Florida next week. It's wildly irresponsible that we are in this position. This is becoming a somewhat regular occurrence with Congress and the disaster relief fund. It's incredibly dangerous.
Well, a lot of them don't believe that this is important, that it's worthwhile. But actually, I want to look at a question that came in from Jim, because today you were talking about on X the difference between refugees and resettling. And Jim says, and he's one of our partners here on the channel, Science Talk with Jim Massa, oceanographer from Alaska. As climate chaos continues, there will be millions of climate refugees worldwide. Add the fact that there is a major overpopulation problem. We're running out of suitable land to house people.
Yeah. So I guess I think about some of this a little bit differently. So I don't necessarily think of it as overpopulation. I think of it as a problem with population distribution, right? The issue isn't only the number of people we have. The issue is where all of those people are and how we're building our communities, right? So you see, speaking of climate havens,
Yes.
here, right? You see that our population centers are on the coast and along rivers, and there are historical reasons for that. But that does mean we have more people living in higher risk areas, right? So a lot of this has to do with like how can we shift where people are living, but even more so, how can we shift how we're building, right? We need to start building that absorbs these hazards rather than crumbles under these hazards. And so that's one thing to note there. In terms of like global refugee, right? So we're already starting to see border crossings related to climate change.
Right.
That's been happening for a while, right?
Yes.
So that is absolutely a concern. Our international immigration system is not at all cut out to handle this. There needs to be a massive reform within that international system. We need to make it, in my opinion, we need to make it easier for people to get to safe places. And particularly, I think the U.S. has a major responsibility in that, given our outsized responsibility for the climate crisis. And the amount of resources that we have as compared to others. And then to connect it to what you were talking about on Twitter today. So I saw a couple articles being written talking about how people who have been affected by Helene are now climate refugees. And
Yeah, that's what I was specifically.
yeah, that's not an accurate use of that term. So refugees is specifically talking about people who are crossing borders, right? This is a legal term. Fortunately, that did not happen here, right? No one is leaving the country
Right.
because of this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I believe it because of this.
Well, maybe
So,
they'll leave if Trump wins.
well, maybe.
Hmm.
So instead, the like kind of most accurate terminology is internally displaced people, right? If somebody has been displaced from their home, we tend
Okay.
to not really use that in the U.S. It's more of an international term, but usually I just say, people who are displaced or disaster survivors, evacuees works as well. But the reason this is like not just a semantic and legal distinction here, this was a huge problem after Katrina, where New Orleanians were called refugees, and it made many of them feel like they were being told they weren't American
Right.
citizens, right? Or that they were
Right.
second-class citizens. And so it's really like connected in this really kind of complex way to this question of citizenship, which for a lot of people right now, especially in the context of this like broader immigration discussion, I don't know, in the country, that's a really like an area that we have to be really careful with our language about.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now, I think we have been 55 minutes, so I think we'll go to some questions. And the first one I'm going to read is from Nadia. She gave me a super chat, so I want to say thank you, Nadia. I love you as always. Uh, how are the risks of killing heat in tandem with power outages in major cities? Example, New York City, where I am. Also, what risks would be aggravated by international isolation due to our berserk leadership? Woof.
Yeah, so we can start with heat waves first. That's maybe the easier question there. Yeah, so concerns about increasing temperatures and heat waves specifically is a huge issue across the country. And again, this is another one where I think when we think of heat waves, we often think of like Phoenix, for example, right? And certainly, again, they're kind of on the forefront here, but
Mhm.
any place in the US can experience a heat wave, right? And it's potentially even more dangerous in the northern parts of the country where our houses are not built in a way to deal with heat, and people are less likely to have air conditioning and et cetera. So,
Right.
kind of important to think about not only how widespread that hazard is, but also thinking about the kind of unique vulnerabilities of various places. And the note there about how does that connect with power outages? That is, a huge fear of anybody in emergency management. There's a lot of planning that is done in emergency management for heat waves and cooling shelters. There's been a lot of conversation recently about what else FEMA specifically can be doing to help communities prepare for this. You see some cities like Miami who have a chief heat officer,
Mhm.
one person who is specializing in how do we handle this situation, looking at putting, air conditioning in public housing and cooling shelters at bus
Ah,
stations. There's a lot of things that we can do. But as is often the case in emergency management, we need more resources and more funding to really be able to go all in preparing our communities for those.
well, we had something in Buffalo, the big snowstorm,
Yeah.
and many people died. And, we would think Buffalo would have been prepared. And obviously, Buffalo was not prepared. So, do you have any insight into that? Did you have anything to do with Buffalo?
So, yeah, I have some things to say about Buffalo. So,
Good. Thank you. Because that's where I worked. I lived, forever. So,
yeah, Buffalo was another city that like to call themselves a climate haven. And when they started that, I think it was in what year was the snowstorm?
I think it's 3 years ago.
Yeah,
Three
I
years
think
ago. Pretty
if I
sure.
remember correctly, I think it was in 2019 that Buffalo started calling themselves a climate haven or a climate refuge, something along those lines.
Yeah.
And at the time I said, well, that's interesting because you do not have an emergency manager for the city of Buffalo. And then the snowstorm happened. You see almost 50 deaths or something around there.
Yes, it was
Um,
horrible.
yeah. And look, I grew up in a northern state as well. We should not be seeing those kinds of death tolls, even in incredibly bad snowstorms. That's not,
Oh,
shouldn't
it
be
was insane. I mean, it was
happening.
shocking.
Yeah, and then in the aftermath of that snowstorm, you saw a fight between Buffalo City Council and the mayor over
Mayor
whether
Brown.
managers should be hired, right? I don't
Right.
think you have to call yourself a climate refuge if you don't even have an emergency manager, right? Like this is bare minimum stuff here, that a city like Buffalo should have. Not just one emergency manager; they need an entire agency with
Mm-hmm.
5, 6 people in it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Because not only is Buffalo going to get worse snowstorms, they're going to get heat waves, and it already has started to happen, and people don't have the houses with air conditioning. They're not prepared at all, I don't think. And
Yeah,
that's my city. You know, I worked at the university for 22 years, so I should know. But it is thank you for addressing that. No,
sure.
I love Buffalo. I really do. So, okay, let's move on to some questions. Oh, here's a heavy one. What is Sam's short and long term outlook for civilization and humanity as climate and overshoot impacts accelerate? Woof.
Look, there is an endless range of possibilities of what the future looks like. I don't think that there is anybody who can predict what direction we're going to go with in terms of climate change. I think that I like to maintain just a little bit of hope and optimism that we're going to come together and work together to figure out how to address climate change and these other related issues. At the same time, part of being in emergency management is being realistic and thinking about what do worst case scenarios look like,
Mm-hmm.
and be doing literally everything possible to try and prevent those worst case scenarios. So I'll kind of tell you guys the same thing I tell my students. It's anybody's guess where we land here. I think we are not going to turn things around tomorrow and address climate change. I also do not think that we are going to experience the very worst impacts of climate change. I think we'll be somewhere in the middle, which is still
Hmm.
bad.
Yeah,
Um,
still bad.
so
Oh God.
be clear, still not good. Um, but I don't think, some of these really, apocalyptic scenarios, I don't necessarily think globally we're going to get there. Certain countries certainly will perhaps feel that way, but
Well, they are now. That's why they're trying to come to the United States. And we need to educate our populace about what's happening in those countries. Maybe there could even be a little empathy for other
sure.
people. You know, right now there's such an anti-immigration and hate for
Mhm.
people that want to come here, and not with not understanding why they're coming here. Mm,
Right.
mm, mm, mm. Okay, let's see. Uh, Tommyist comment is stop development in marshes. Marshes absorb a lot of CO2 and they are a buffer against flood and storm surges. Thank you,
Agree.
Tommy. Yeah. And Gary. I love Gary. All right. Gary, bankrupt property insurance means a bankrupt real estate market. We do not have resources to build for resilience in most places. Best to care for one another and accept our vulnerability.
Uh, yeah, important to make that connection between the real estate market and insurance. Florida leading the way on that one. Um, I I don't know if accepting our vulnerability is what we need to do, right? I do think that there are things we can do, right? And local communities are going to need to rethink how they're spending money in their cities. State governments are going to need to put more towards resilience-related efforts, and the federal government is going to need to spend a lot more money on this, right? And I think if there is a real concerted effort there, right, if we had an actual national climate adaptation plan, I think there's some real potential there to take a dent out of some of what we can expect to experience. Of course, we're not going to eliminate all risk. That's not really possible. So I guess in that sense, right, we have to accept some vulnerability. And I think that's where we turn towards community, right, and pooling resources and caring for neighbors, right, at that kind of.
Yeah, and that is a number one thing in my book, is that in planning for these things, you have to get to know your neighbors, and there has to be contingent plans to. I know around here, I know people, we started to talk about the farmers that I am around. We've already started to talk, because I brought it up, about what would happen in these kind of instances. What can we do as a community to pull together? But there's so much work. But I think they're finally seeing it. Even though I live in a very red area, they're seeing it with the tornadoes, so that have hit people's homes. Let's see.
And I'll say too, we've seen that completely during Helene, right? If you look past all this noise, and you read like the local news articles coming out of North Carolina, what you see in every single one again and again, which is what we expect to see during a disaster, is that people are working together, neighbors are helping neighbors, people are not just sitting around waiting for government to show up, they're taking action themselves. That mutual aid that we expect to see is there, it's working in full force, right? This is a big disaster. So there are a lot of unmet needs. It's going to take time, which I know is frustrating to folks.
Of course.
That community is absolutely there in North Carolina and the other states as well.
Okay, let's see here. Some good. Everybody's very invested in this. Okay. Do you, Jean? Hi, Jean. Jean's one of our moderators. Question: do you deal with or study the people displaced from chemical disasters or poisoned water, which we see is happening right now in Georgia?
Yeah. So I study all hazards, right? So I'm looking at this from an emergency management perspective, but yeah, I study all hazards. So that would include chemical spills. You mentioned Atlanta right now. The Palestine train derailment was another more recent event. Depending on kind of what the situation is, the emergency management system is going to be involved in different ways. FEMA will be involved in different ways. Oftentimes, those types of events fall more under the EPA, and then also HHS with like the health element of things. So there's a kind of a slightly different line of law and policy related to those events, but emergency management often interfaces, and especially on the bigger events.
How do you feel about the potential for Project 2025? Actually, when you speak about you speak about the EPA and all. Have you looked into this, and will it affect it will affect emergency managers and disasterology?
Project 2025 is disastrous for effective emergency management in the U.S. In a couple of different ways. One, there are parts of Project 2025 that directly affect FEMA as an agency in ways that would eliminate most of their involvement in recovery. For example, it would pass that off to states
and churches.
You need the federal government. They don't have the resources otherwise. It talks about moving FEMA into other agencies in a way that is not useful to anybody. But then even almost, in some ways, almost more so than the direct FEMA impacts, the loss of the National Weather Service. I don't know how we send effective warnings or do evacuations without the National Weather Service, right? To have privatized weather is kind of incomprehensible in terms of ensuring that life-saving information is reaching the public. So, and then the damage to the EPA and beyond, right? All these other federal agencies doing things that directly affect emergency management, affect our risk, affect how FEMA is involved.
Yeah, I don't mean to go, oh boy, but it's overwhelming. And it's overwhelming. Overwhelming. All right, let's see. Hello, Dennis from Germany. How soon do you expect the coastal housing market going bankrupt, higher or no insurance, higher mortgage, sinking property value will crash the economy like '08 with ever increasing disasters?
Yeah, great question. We could get really rich if we knew the answer to this. No, I don't know, right? So it depends on so many factors, right? Currently, the state of Florida is not really doing anything, and is kind of intentionally not doing anything to help shore up the insurance industry, for example, right? If somebody within Florida state government decides that they are going to do that, well, then that changes our timing here. It also depends on what kind of hurricanes we have. If we have a Category 5 direct hit, destroys all of Miami, we're a real estate problem much more quickly than we were expecting, right? But maybe that doesn't happen for another 20 years. So maybe it's fine, right? It depends on the events that we have. It depends on state legislation, and it depends on federal action.
Okay. Nadia, thank you. Another one. She's really wonderful. Super chat. Are big crop failures in the scope of emergency management?
Yeah, again, this is another one where the Department of Agriculture is usually kind of the lead agency for that. But depending on the situation in terms of like why crops failed, right? If it's from flooding or something, then emergency management will be more involved as opposed to like an infestation or something.
Okay. All right. Well, we're getting to an hour and 11 minutes. Well, Donald, his comment is either our government helps and prepares for these disasters and helps those affected by the aftermath, or we fend for ourselves and possibly die. I only see two options. And Donald's not even a doomer. Donald's a musician and a progressive.
Yeah,
that's a tough one, Don. It hurts to read that.
Well, it is. I think though that it's a combination of both, right? I don't think it's either or. I think that we need government absolutely to be involved in emergency management, but we also need everyone else to be involved in emergency management. It is not at all realistic that government is going to come in and do everything when a disaster happens. They just can't. And so I think really the kind of success for the future here is figuring out a way for us to work together to be able to make it through these events.
Okay. Let's see here. My friend Alan Rollins switch. The disaster started long ago when the land was changed to agriculture and later covered with chemicals and poisons. As insect population falls, so many plants depend on them as do the birds. It's just a comment, but I thought maybe, you would.
I fully appreciate that. I think that is something that's actually really important to keep in mind. We focus on emergency management here, but when we think about the impacts of climate change, emergency management is responsible for these more acute events and these more acute moments of crisis that occur. But there are all of these other consequences, right? The sixth extinction, the impacts to the broader environment. All of those things are part of climate adaptation and have a direct effect on what our risk looks like, what, our food supply and our water supply looks like. And when we see failures in those places, that's where emergency management has to step in. So emergency management has a vested interest in addressing those other kind of broader climate issues and environmental issues.
Gary says, "Do you? It sounds like we are not planning for increasing climate chaos. We have normalcy bias built into our disaster planning, don't we?"
Yeah, I mean, emergency managers are aware of climate change, right? It's being
Absolutely.
integrated into the risk assessments that we're doing in our communities. That said, we are not doing anywhere near enough planning for the changes that climate change is bringing.
Wow. All right, let's see. Well, we're getting close to an hour and a half, so we're gonna wrap it up. Well, it's an hour and 15 minutes, but one of the things we do on our channel is called the Environmental Coffee House Flush of the Day. We
Mhm.
flush something ugly or we don't like or we really hate. And you are the honorary flush picker today. What would you flush away if you had a dream to flush something away and make it not happen or anything? What would it be?
Well, I think we have to go with the obvious one here is that I would flush away these conspiracy theories on Twitter and on these other platforms.
Bye bye, conspiracy theories on the platform. That's a good one. I couldn't have picked a better one after today. It was so stressful for me and you, both of us today, just trying to counter. It was coming hot and heavy to counter it all. And
Yeah.
I probably pissed a lot of people on my Facebook off because, quite frankly, on my Facebook, I have a lot of high school friends and biker friends that are in the cult. And they've been unusually quiet with all of my these are my personal posts. We have a Facebook group, we have a Facebook page, we have I'm trying to do, believe it or not, I'm uploading now on Rumble. I'm going to see how long it takes me to get kicked off. Uh there was one question that I thought where is it, Heidi? Oh, jeez. I don't remember where it is. I wanted to. Oh, here. This is Oliver. Hi, Oliver, and thank you for the super chat, Oliver. You talk about preparation before disasters. How might this play out before massive hurricanes, but also the flip of the coin, wildfires?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of similarities between the two. So in terms of preparedness, you'd want to think about this at like the individual level. So what are each of us doing to be prepared? Um, Kind of the easiest way to think about that is do you have the ability to leave your home very quickly? And then the kind of the opposite of that, do you have the ability to stay in your home for a really long time, right? Those tend to be our two options there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have the things that you need to be able to do either one of those? And then we also think about preparedness though at like a community level or organizational level. And that looks like making, Buffalo, making sure you have an emergency management agency, making sure that you're planning in your community and that everybody knows what those plans are and that the appropriate agencies have gone through training and know how to communicate with one another. Do you have the appropriate systems in place to be able to maintain communications during response, right? So those kind of more community level things.
Yeah. All right. A few more, and then Karen, our wonderful friend from California. Fires are burning here right now. 300 acres in 2 hours. California, of course. I feel for people in the hurricane mess. Fires are so devastating. And hello, folks. What do you have to say to someone like Karen who's in harm's way and it's frequent? And I worry about her all the time.
Yeah, it's so stressful. Yeah, it's really scary. It's stressful. I think what I would say is that every part of the country is experiencing disasters in some way. And I think sometimes there can almost be a little bit of competition between those disasters, right? People feel like my disaster was worse than your disaster, or,
Mm.
think that people don't really understand what they went through. And obviously everyone's experience is unique, but I actually think as somebody who talks to disaster survivors across the country all the time, there are way more commonalities between everyone than there are differences, right? If you've been through a wildfire and you've had to rebuild your house, you have actually had a very similar experience to somebody who has had their house flooded and needs to rebuild in a hurricane. And I think that there is I think there's real potential and real power in disaster survivors specifically coming together across the country and working to advocate for changes to how we do emergency management. I think we have a lot of knowledge that can be shared from different parts of the country with one another.
And that leads me to Heidi's question, who is from Maine and who is shouting out to you. Also, do you know if there's a Facebook emergency response page for Hurricane Helene? If yes, I haven't seen it yet, but if there is one, how accurate is it? Because now, as we were talking about all the bullshit that's floating around and all the conspiracies and all of that, do you know of any Facebook community yet?
I will tell you, I'm not even open Facebook this week. I have no idea.
Pretty scary, huh?
I'm sure there are. In terms of the accuracy of information, that one's tough. I would say try to look for groups that are being run by locals.
That's what I thought.
Have the best information. Yeah, but
that's what I thought. Well, thank you, Heidi, because yes, she's a fellow Maine from the Wabanaki territory. Cool. All right, so I think we've done fairly well here. Let's see, is there anything else that I think? Oh, Bila. Well, but we've poisoned everything. And oblivious to it all, cell phone zombies babble through the shopping malls. Yeah. I mean, that's a comment that seems to be frequent on at least around our channel. But and Alex, who runs the Climate Crisis Club on every Saturday morning on Spaces. Dr. Montano is my pick to deal with the UFOs when they show up.
Alex, but no thanks. Y'all are.
You're on your own with the alien stuff, right? Okay. Well, I think this has been a wonderful talk. I have so enjoyed it, and I want to thank you. I really do. I want to thank everybody out there for the super chats that help the channel. I want to thank everybody for coming. Please, when you can, could you please share this to all your platforms so that we can make a difference and make a dent, and people can hear Samantha's voice, and we can counter the disinformation and the misinformation. It's very important. We didn't even get into it as deep as we did on X today, but it's stressful, and it's something that I really am invested in, is countering all the crap, because it makes me so angry. So I'm going to give you the last word. What would you like to say?
Oh, I'll just say that I'm very appreciative for everybody who's here and taking the time to even learn about emergency management. I know it's not always the most uplifting topic, but it's something that's really important and affects all of us. And so I'm always grateful when people are willing to learn more.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you. I want to thank you all. It's been really pretty uplifting for me, and we even got to get into a flush of the day. So here we go. All right. Thanks, everybody. Peace. See you Tuesday night. Thank you, Samantha. I would love to have you back.
Anytime.
All right, guys. Here we go. The good night part.